Today we will be reading Luke 24, 13 through 31. The walk to Emmaus. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe that all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. May God bless these words to our understanding.
This is the first time Jesus appears after Easter in Luke's Gospel. We were in John last week. We're in Luke this week. We're in John again next week. But this week we're in Luke. The first part of chapter 24 is what we read on Easter Sunday. When a group of women go to the tomb and they find it empty, and as Cleopas recounts to the stranger on the road, they were told, "He's not here." And they go back and they tell the others who considered it an idle tale, or they considered the women to be delirious. But Peter runs to the tomb and also sees that it's empty and starts to understand. Later that same day, Cleopas and his unnamed partner, many people have chosen to assume that the unnamed partner is his wife. But they're walking to Emmaus. There's a song on a cassette, which apparently I've lost because I went looking for it this week. I actually still have something that will play cassettes. My daughters think I'm strange. But anyway, fleeing from the city with a smell of death so strong, a stranger on the road invites himself to walk along. And as they walk, they talk. And this highlights the first of the three things I find in this story. In Luke's gospel, one of the ways Easter is shown, one of the ways the resurrection is announced, is by reminding people of the story. Because Cleopas says, well, this is what's happened. And then the stranger says, do you not remember? And he goes back over everything, starting with Moses through the prophets, recounting it in light of the Jesus movement, in light of what they've learned from Jesus. Part of how we get to Easter is by being reminded of the story, by remembering the story, not just that weekend, but the story of faith. But Cleopas and his partner still don't get it. As Luke tells it, something is still preventing them from understanding. So they get to Emmaus, which is where they were headed. The stranger, it appears, was headed farther. No, stay. I think of many times when come in for a bite, just for a bite. I'll put the kettle on. John Spong, the late John Spong, in his book about the resurrection, Myth or Reality, suggests a number of things about what Easter, that first Easter, must have been. One thing he says is that it doesn't happen all at once. We have multiple stories in the Gospels about Jesus appearing at different times, helping people understand. Spong suggests that for some it doesn't even happen in Jerusalem. For some it happens in Galilee, which is, of course, where they're told to go. They don't seem to listen well, but they are told to go to Galilee, and Jesus will meet them there. We'll find that next week when we go back to John. But one of the things that Spong mentions is that somehow Easter is revealed at table. Somehow the risen Christ is revealed when people get together and they eat together. Which we know because from the very beginning, before they were even called Christians, the followers of Jesus, whenever they got together, they would eat together. To this day, when the church gets together, we like to eat together. Whether it be a potluck, a beef dinner, gathering around a campfire, gathering in a church basement. Something about eating together reveals the presence of Christ. And that's what happens for Cleopas and his friend. They invite the stranger in, so they should be the host, right? But the stranger takes on the role of host. And he takes the loaf, and he blesses it, and he breaks it, and he passes it to them. Which brings back two stories, at least two stories. One, of course, is that last meal Jesus has with his friends. But the other is just a bit earlier. Because that's what Jesus does when he gathers up those small loaves of bread and the fishes in front of a crowd of thousands. He blesses it, he breaks it, and he passes it to them. And in that act, the scales fall off their eyes, and they realize. And then later they say, how did we not know that all the way along? How did we get that when, how? Which leads me to the second thing I find in this story. Words sometimes are not enough. And I say that as a person who loves words. Words are not enough. We need visuals. We need ritual. We need something else to reveal Christ, to remind us of God's presence. Maybe it's the breaking of bread. Maybe it's, in some traditions, pulling down the kneeler from the pew in front of you and kneeling. Just that act. Or genuflecting as you approach the front of the church. Maybe it's liturgical dance. Not me. Not me. We need sometimes to go beyond the words, because words are really quite limited when we get down to it. Visuals and ritual are one of the ways God is revealed. Sometimes I think we forget that. But I think the third thing I realized about this story this week is possibly the most important. Because when the stranger on the road encounters them and they say, well, we're told this happened, but we don't really get it. The response could have been, well, to quote a certain Dark Lord of the Sith, I find your lack of faith disturbing. Possibly complete with the force choke, who knows? But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus hears where they're at and says, okay, we're going to start there. God meets us where we're at and leads us to a new place. That's how we come to encounter Easter. God meets us where we're at that day, because we're not always at the same place, and leads us through word, through ritual, maybe just through presence. The church, as we pronounce and announce and celebrate and proclaim the promise of resurrection, the promise of new life, the promise of a changed world, is called to do all three things. We are called to remind each other of the story. And maybe one day I do the reminding, and maybe one day I'm the one who forgets it and somebody else needs to remind me. We play different roles on different days. But we're called to remind each other, remember. We're called to move beyond words, to find the symbols. I'm thinking of a bubble machine for Out of the Lake. It will be Pentecost Sunday. We're talking about the Spirit. Bubbles. Swirling ribbons have been used. But we're called to not just get so locked into our words, and that's a danger in much of the Western church. We're a word culture. We're a culture that passes on information by saying, read chapter 12. We'll discuss it later. But teachers know that there are students who need to do something other than read chapter 12 and answer a bunch of questions. So as the church, we're called to find those other ways. Some of it is this, or this. Notice our sacraments are very visual. We pour water. We break bread. We pour the juice. But that's part of how we remind ourselves of the story. And the third and most important, we need to meet people where they're at that particular day. I'm not sure the church does that well. I think sometimes we assume, well, people know all these things. For years we assumed it. One of the ongoing discussions I had throughout my candidacy was people were trying to wrestle with this fact that we've got all these people coming to church and they don't know the basic stories. Then tell them the stories. Don't lament the fact that they don't know them. Say, oh, we've got a job to do. And when we do those three things, we remind each other of the story, where we find ways beyond just words, and when we intentionally say, I'm going to meet you where you're at. Okay, if we actually say that, it sounds kind of condescending. But when we intentionally do that, and not assume they're somewhere else, it takes time to find out, to talk with people. When we do those three things, we proclaim the presence of God. When we do those three things, we invite people into a relationship. When we get them wrong, we don't do that. When we get them wrong, when we make assumptions, when we pass on the, how can you not know that? And the church has done that. We don't invite people in. May God help us to pass on the stories. May God help us to find new ways of telling them. May God help us to listen to each other and know where we're at that day, so our discussion can be there and not where we wish it was. And in that way, may we see the risen Christ and run all the way back to Jerusalem, 7 miles, full of excitement. You won't believe what happened. Christ is risen. New life is a possibility. The world is being changed. Amen.